The knock on the door came unexpectedly, breaking the silence of the lazy afternoon. Jane paused, her heart giving a small, startled jump. She wasn't expecting anyone. With a cautious step, she made her way to the door, wiping her hands on her jeans before turning the knob. As the door swung open, she was met with a familiar face. Ryan, her husband's closest friend, standing there with a casual smirk, his dark eyes flickering with amusement. "Hey, hope I'm not catching you at a bad time," Ryan said, his voice smooth, effortless. Jane blinked, momentarily thrown off by his presence. It wasn't that she disliked Ryan, far from it. He had always been around, always part of their social circle, and yet she had never been alone with him before. She leaned against the doorframe, crossing her arms. "No, just wasn't expecting anyone," she admitted, offering a small smile. "What brings you here?" "Your husband mentioned I left some of my tools in the garage last time I was over. Thought I'd swing by and grab them." His eyes flickered over her, quick but deliberate, as if taking her in properly for the first time. Jane hesitated before stepping aside, allowing him in. "Right, of course. Come on in." Ryan walked in with easy confidence, his presence somehow filling the space differently than her husband's ever did. There was something about the way he moved, the way he carried himself. It was hard not to notice. She shook the thought away. "So," Ryan said, looking around, "house is quiet without him here, huh?" Jane let out a soft chuckle, nodding. "Yeah, a little too quiet, honestly." She walked toward the kitchen counter, reaching for her water glass. "He's out of town for work. Won't be back for a few days." Ryan leaned against the counter, watching her with an expression that was unreadable, but far from casual. "Must be nice to have the house to yourself," he commented, his voice light, but something about it felt weighted. Jane shrugged, taking a sip of her drink. "Sometimes. Other times it's just boring." She glanced up at him then, realizing that he was closer than before, his body angled slightly toward hers. Ryan smirked, resting an arm against the countertop. "Well, guess I showed up just in time then. Can't have you getting bored all by yourself." There was something in his tone, something playful yet laced with an edge she wasn't sure how to place. Jane let out a breathy laugh, shaking her head. "Oh, so you're my entertainment for the afternoon?" Ryan grinned. "Could be." She rolled her eyes, but couldn't ignore the way her stomach fluttered at his words. She had never looked at Ryan this way before, never really noticed the sharpness of his jaw, the way his muscles tensed slightly beneath his shirt, the way his gaze lingered a second too long. The realization sent a small, unexpected thrill through her, a thrill she wasn't sure she should be feeling. Jane leaned against the counter, watching as Ryan casually made his way to the garage door. He moved with an easy confidence, his presence oddly comfortable in a space that wasn't his. She shouldn't have been so aware of him, of the way his shirt clung just right to his frame, or how his eyes held hers a beat too long. "How's the trip going?" Ryan asked, glancing back at her while opening the door. She shrugged. "Same as always. Meetings, late-night calls. Barely enough time to check in with me. You know how it is." Ryan smirked, grabbing the toolbox he had left behind. "Yeah, he never shuts up about work. I don't know how you put up with it." Jane rolled her eyes, taking a sip of water. "I guess I'm used to it." Ryan walked back into the kitchen, setting the toolbox down on the floor beside him. "He's lucky, you know," he said, his tone lighter, teasing. "Not many women would be so patient with that schedule." Jane let out a breathy laugh, shaking her head. "It's not about patience. It's just life." Ryan tilted his head slightly. "Maybe, or maybe you're just too good for him." The words lingered in the air between them, unexpected and heavier than they should have been. Jane shifted, suddenly hyper-aware of the closeness between them. It wasn't inappropriate, at least not yet, but something about it felt charged. She walked over to the fridge, needing a distraction. "You want a drink?" she asked over her shoulder. "Sure," Ryan answered, moving beside her as she grabbed 2 bottles of water. When she turned to hand him one, their fingers brushed just for a second, but the contact sent a jolt through her. Jane exhaled sharply, her pulse quickening at the unexpected sensation. Ryan didn't pull away immediately, his fingers lingering slightly before finally taking the bottle from her. "Thanks," he said, his voice quieter, lower than before. She swallowed hard, suddenly feeling too warm in the kitchen. She laughed lightly, trying to brush off whatever strange tension was settling between them. "You really do make yourself at home, don't you?" Ryan leaned again, NS'd the counter, taking a sip of his drink. "What can I say?" "Your place is nice. I could get used to it." His words sent an unfamiliar thrill through her, one she knew she shouldn't feel. She studied him for a moment, noting the way he seemed completely at ease, how he wasn't in any hurry to leave. Jane wasn't sure if it was in her head or if something had shifted, but she knew one thing: Ryan wasn't acting like just her husband's friend anymore, and the most dangerous part, she wasn't stopping him. A sudden flicker, and then everything went dark. Jane sucked in a breath as the hum of the refrigerator silenced, the ceiling fans stilled, and the only light left in the room was the faint glow filtering through the window from the street lamp outside. The storm had knocked out the power. Ryan exhaled sharply beside her, the unexpected darkness shifting the energy in the room. "Well," he muttered, pulling his phone out, "guess we're doing this old school." The bright beam of his flashlight cut through the dimness, casting long shadows across the countertops. Jane let out a nervous chuckle, crossing her arms. "Figures. Just when I thought the day couldn't get more inconvenient." Ryan grinned, stepping closer to her as he pointed the light toward the breaker panel near the hallway. "Let's check if it's just a trip or if the whole neighborhood's out." He moved first, and instinctively Jane followed, the silence of the house amplifying every step they took. The storm outside grew louder, rain pattering against the windows, thunder rumbling in the distance. When they reached the panel, Ryan angled the flashlight up, illuminating the switches. "Doesn't look like anything tripped," he murmured. "Probably the whole block." Jane sighed, rubbing her arms. "Great. Guess I should find some candles." She turned to leave, but Ryan caught her by the waist. Gentle, just enough to stop her. The warmth of his hand sent a jolt through her skin. "Wait," he said, his voice quieter now. "You feel that?" Jane's breath hitched as she realized how close they were. The air between them had thickened, heavy with something unspoken. His hand lingered, not quite holding her, but not letting go either. She swallowed, heart hammering in her chest. "Feel what?" Ryan's lips quirked up in a small smirk, but his eyes were different now, darker, focused. "This," he murmured. His fingers skimmed down her waist before he finally pulled his hand away, as if testing how long she'd let him touch her. Jane felt frozen in place, unsure whether to step back or lean in. The dim glow of his phone cast a soft light over his face, highlighting the sharp cut of his jaw, the way his lips parted slightly as he studied her. The silence stretched, only the sound of rain and distant thunder filling the room. Jane's breathing grew uneven. She knew this was a dangerous moment, that she should laugh it off, make some excuse to put space between them. But she didn't move, neither did he. Ryan's voice was almost a whisper now. "You know I've always thought you were—" A sudden crack of thunder made Jane jump, her shoulder bumping against his chest. He caught her, his hand settling on her lower back, steadying her. Neither of them stepped away. Neither of them let go. And in that moment Jane knew this wasn't just an accident anymore. Ryan's breath was warm against her skin, his hand still resting against the curve of her waist. Neither of them moved, neither willing to acknowledge the shift that had taken place between them. The dim glow from his phone screen cast shadows on his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw, the tension in his expression. Jane felt the weight of his stare, the unspoken words that hung between them. Her mind screamed for her to take a step back, to create distance before they crossed a line that couldn't be undone. But her body betrayed her, rooted in place, drawn to him in a way she couldn't ignore. Ryan's fingers tightened slightly on her waist, pulling her just an inch closer. He was testing the waters, waiting to see if she would pull away, if she would stop him before it was too late. But she didn't. His hand came up slowly, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face, his fingertips grazing her cheek. Her skin burned where he touched, the simple gesture sending a shiver down her spine. "You feel this too, don't you?" His voice was low, rough, barely more than a whisper. Jane swallowed, her pulse pounding in her ears. She should lie. She should laugh it off, pretend that none of this was real. But when she finally spoke, the truth slipped past her lips before she could stop it. Yes. That was all it took. Ryan closed the distance, his lips pressing softly against hers, hesitant at first. A slow, testing kiss, giving her the chance to pull away, to stop this before it went any further. But she didn't move, didn't resist. Instead, she found herself leaning into him, her fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt, holding him. There. A soft exhale left his lips as he deepened the kiss, his hand sliding up to cup the back of her neck. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a confession, a collision of built-up tension and unsaid words. Jane knew this was wrong, knew that if she had any sense left, she would stop this before it spiraled out of control. But the way Ryan held her, the way his body pressed against hers, made it impossible to think clearly. His hands moved down, gripping her waist, pulling her flush against him. She could feel the heat radiating off his skin, the steady beat of his heart against her own. Every nerve in her body was on fire, consumed by the rush of something she hadn't felt in years, something wild, something reckless, something completely forbidden. The room around them blurred into nothingness, the storm outside a distant hum. There was no logic, no second thoughts, only this moment, only him, and she let herself fall into it, surrendering completely to the desire neither of them had the strength to deny. The room was silent except for the rhythmic sound of rain against the window. Jane's breath was still uneven, her skin warm from the lingering touch of Ryan's hands. Reality began creeping in, slow but suffocating, tightening around her chest. She pulled the blanket up, gripping the fabric like it could shield her from the weight of what had just happened. Ryan lay beside her, his arm draped lazily across her waist, his breathing steady, content. But Jane couldn't mirror that ease. She stared at the ceiling, her mind racing, trying to piece together how she had gotten here, how a simple afternoon had spiraled into something she couldn't take back. She sat up suddenly, her pulse pounding, her body still betraying her with the aftershocks of what they had just done. Her hands trembled as she reached for her clothes, the weight of guilt pressing down on her like an anchor. Ryan shifted, propping himself up on one elbow as he watched her. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, satisfaction mixed with understanding. "Jane," he murmured, his voice still thick with the remnants of desire. She shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. Her heart hammered in her chest, her stomach twisting as she pulled her shirt back on. "We shouldn't have done this," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. Ryan exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face before sitting up beside her. "I know," he said, but there was no urgency in his voice, no panic, just quiet acceptance. But you wanted it, just like I did. His words sent another rush through her, a reminder of the way she had melted into him, how natural, how right it had felt in the moment. And yet now it felt like an earthquake had torn through her world, leaving destruction in its wake. She pressed her hands to her face, inhaling deeply, trying to steady herself. "This can't happen again," she said firmly, though the way her voice wavered made it clear she was trying to convince herself more than him. Ryan reached out, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "No one has to know," he murmured, his tone gentle, reassuring. But the words didn't bring her comfort. They only deepened the pit forming in her stomach. It wasn't just about someone finding out. It was about what this meant for her marriage, for everything she had built. She finally looked at Ryan, her eyes filled with conflict. "You should go." Ryan studied her for a moment, then nodded, reaching for his clothes without another word. He dressed in silence, and for the first time since he had stepped into her house, the air between them felt different, tainted, heavy with something neither of them could name. As he reached the door, he paused, glancing back at her. "You're not the only one who feels guilty," he admitted before stepping out into the storm. The door clicked shut behind him, and Jane was left alone in the dimly lit room, the sound of the rain now deafening. Jane moved quickly, straightening the couch cushions, smoothing the fabric where Ryan's hands had gripped. Every crease felt like evidence, every misplaced object, a reminder of what had just happened. She grabbed the blanket and tossed it into the laundry basket, as if washing it would erase the moment that had unfolded here. Her hands trembled as she wiped the coffee table, her heart racing with the paranoia that some trace of him lingered in the air, waiting to be discovered. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and she nearly dropped the cleaning spray she had been clutching. The screen flashed with her husband's name. A wave of nausea hit her as she stared at it, hesitating for a second too long before finally answering. "Hey, babe," she said, forcing a lightness into her voice that felt foreign in her own mouth. "Hey," her husband's voice came through, casual, oblivious. "Just wanted to check in. How's your day been?" Jane swallowed, gripping the phone tighter. "Good. Just you..." "No, the usual. Ran some errands, did some cleaning." The lie rolled off her tongue too smoothly, too easily. Ryan stood by the door, his arms crossed as he watched her. His expression was unreadable, but something in his eyes told her he was listening carefully, amused by the way she was already covering her tracks. "Everything okay with the Wi-Fi?" her husband asked. She forced herself to turn away from Ryan's gaze. "Yeah, all good now," she replied, clearing her throat. "No more issues." "That's great," her husband said. I miss you. I'll be home in a few days." The guilt struck hard, a sharp knife twisting in her stomach. "I miss you too," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan smirked at that, his head tilting slightly as if daring her to acknowledge what they both knew. She hadn't been missing her husband an hour ago. "All right, I'll let you get back to whatever you were doing," her husband said. "Love you." "Love you too," Jane murmured before ending the call. She exhaled shakily, setting the phone down as if it had burned her fingers. Ryan chuckled softly, finally speaking. "That was convincing," Jane shot him a glare. "You should go." He took a step closer instead, his voice lower now. "Are you sure about that?" She clenched her jaw, the guilt fighting with the memory of his touch. This was a mistake. Ryan studied her, his smirk fading into something more thoughtful. "Maybe," he said, shrugging. "But you didn't stop me." Jane turned away, unable to meet his eyes. "Just go." Ryan walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. "If you ever want to talk, you know where to find me." His voice was softer now, almost tempting. She didn't respond. The door closed behind him, and as she stood in the silence of the house, The weight of her actions settled fully on her shoulders. The room felt different now, tainted, heavy with something she could never take back. The front door swung open and her husband stepped inside, setting his bag down with a relieved sigh. Jane stood frozen in the kitchen, gripping a coffee mug like it was the only thing keeping her upright. He turned to her with a tired smile, his eyes warm, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her. "God, it feels good to be home," he said, walking toward her. Jane forced a smile, letting him wrap his arms around her. The familiar scent of his cologne filled her senses. The weight of his embrace should have felt comforting, but instead it sent a sharp pang of guilt through her chest. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to relax, but the memory of Ryan's touch was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. "I missed you," he murmured against her hair. She swallowed hard. "Me too." His hands rested on her waist, pulling her closer, and she tensed instinctively. She felt his breath against her cheek. His lips, brushing hers, dipped softly before deepening the kiss. Her stomach churned. The betrayal sat heavy in her gut, but she kissed him back, desperate to drown in the illusion of normalcy. "Let's order in tonight," he suggested, pulling away just enough to look at her. "Stay in, just us." She nodded, not trusting her voice. She should have been relieved that he was home, that life could fall back into place. But instead, all she could think about was Ryan, his hands on her skin, his breath on her lips, the way he had looked at her before he walked out the door. Later that night, they met up with friends for drinks, her husband eager to catch up after his trip. The bar was buzzing with conversation, laughter filling the air as familiar faces gathered around. And then she saw him. Ryan stood across the room, laughing at something someone had said, a drink in his hand. He looked relaxed, unaffected. But then, as if sensing her gaze, he turned. Their eyes met, and everything else around her faded. For a split second she saw it, the flicker of something dangerous, something unfinished. His lips curled into the smallest smirk, a silent acknowledgement of what they had done. Jane's pulse quickened. She tore her gaze away, gripping her glass tighter. Her husband leaned in, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You okay?" She forced herself to smile, nodding. "Yeah, just tired." Ryan didn't approach her, didn't say a word, but his presence lingered, seeping into her thoughts, reminding her that secrets don't just disappear. As the night wore on, Jane realized she wasn't just afraid of getting caught. She was afraid of what it meant that she wasn't sure she regretted it. Would it happen again? She didn't know, and that terrified her more than anything else.